The wheels touched down with a jolt, and the familiar chime for seatbelts rang above me. 14 hours in the air, and my body felt as heavy as the grief sitting in my chest. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and typed the simplest message I could manage. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can you pick me up? I stared at the screen for a moment before pressing send. It wasn't a plea, just a practical question. After everything that had happened over the past week, standing in the damp Irish soil, watching my sister's casket lowered into the ground, it felt natural to think my own family would meet me at the end of the journey home. The reply came almost instantly. 4 words. Figure it out. I blinked, certain I'd read it wrong. I checked again. No. There it was, short and cold, like a door slammed in my face. There was no, how was the flight? No. Are you okay? Just dismissal wrapped in indifference. My chest tightened, and I pressed the phone to my lap, feeling the burn of humiliation more than the sting of fatigue. Around me, passengers unbuckled, stretching and smiling as they reached for overhead bags. The man in the seat beside me caught my eye and gave a polite nod, the kind strangers share at the end of a shared journey. I nodded back, forcing my lips into something resembling gratitude. I moved through the terminal, dragging my carry-on behind me. The fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors, each step echoing louder than the last. Families clustered near the arrival's gate faces, lighting up as loved ones emerged. I kept my gaze ahead, past the reunion hugs and welcome signs. Outside, the crisp air hit my face. I joined the taxi line, wrapping my coat tighter around me. When my turn came, I gave the driver my address, voice low but steady. As the cab pulled away from the curb, I watched the airport disappear in the rearview mirror. By the time we turned onto my street, the sun was slipping below the trees' shadows, stretching long across the pavement, and I knew the quiet waiting at home would feel heavier than ever. The taxi rolled to a stop in front of my townhouse, the tires crunching softly against the gravel. I paid, the driver stepped out, and wheeled my suitcase up the short path to the door. The key slid in easily. Inside, the air was still untouched. I set the suitcase by the wall and placed the small leather satchel, holding the last of my sister's keepsakes, on the table. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. It wasn't the comforting quiet of home. It was the kind that reminded you no one had been waiting for you. I moved to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and stood by the counter as it came to a boil, my mind drifting back over the years. Rihanna had once been so warm to me. She used to call for advice on recipes, bring the children over for weekends, laugh easily in my kitchen. I'd been there through it all, late-night babysitting, when their sitter canceled, covering an electric bill, during one brutal winter, even hosting birthdays, when they couldn't afford the party they wanted. None of that had been asked for in writing. It was just what you did for family. But lately, the tone had changed. Conversations with Lucan became clipped, as though every call was an obligation. Rihanna's texts, when they came at all, felt like business transactions. I told myself it was just the busyness of life, but today's message had stripped away that excuse. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. It was Moretta, my neighbor, holding a container of soup. I saw the cab, she said with a smile. Thought you might not feel like cooking. I invited her in, and we sat at the table while she asked about the trip. I gave her the condensed version, funeral rain, too many formalities. She frowned when I mentioned taking a taxi from the airport. They didn't pick you up, she asked quietly. I shook my head, and something in her expression shifted. She hesitated, as if there was more she wanted to say, but she only sipped her tea instead. Her pause stayed with me long after she left, curling into my thoughts as the evening deepened. 2 days passed in the slow rhythm of unpacking and catching up on small chores. The satchel with my sister's keepsakes remained on the table untouched, as if moving it would make her absence more permanent. Moretta stopped by again that morning, this time with a bag of muffins. We sat on the porch, letting the crisp Maine air drift around us. She was telling me about a sale at the farmer's market when her tone shifted. "You know she began while you were away. I saw quite a few cars outside your place one evening. Looked like something fancy dresses, champagne glasses, the works?" I looked at her sharply. "Here, are you sure?" "Oh, I'm sure," she said, nodding toward my front door. It was late. Lights were on, music playing. "Thought you'd rented the place out or something." I tried to picture it, strangers milling around my living room, their voices spilling into the night. My grip tightened on my mug. "Did you see who was here?" Moretta hesitated, glancing away. I did notice Rihanna on the porch. She was wearing a silk scarf, deep green with gold threads. Striking thing. Reminded me of the one you always wore to your garden parties. A hollow chill spread through me. It was the scarf my sister had given me for a birthday many years ago, hand-woven with exquisite care, and one I had treasured ever since. I didn't tell Moretta that. Instead, I forced a small smile, thanked her for the muffins, and changed the subject. But inside, the thought wouldn't let go. Someone had been in my house, and not just to water the plants. When she left, I went straight to my bedroom and pulled open the drawer where I kept the scarf. The other items were still in place, but the spot where it should have been was empty. My hand rested on the bare wood, the absence colder than the air in the room. I stood there for a long moment, the quiet of the room now feeling invasive rather than empty. Somewhere between locking my door and returning home, something had shifted, and I needed to know exactly what it was before it shifted further. I sat on the edge of my bed, the empty space in the drawer pulling me backward through time. I could see myself 20 years younger, standing in Lucan's first apartment, rocking his newborn while he signed paperwork for a job he desperately needed. Rihanna had been sitting on the couch then, exhausted, but smiling, thanking me for showing up without being asked. Those years blurred into a steady rhythm, me slipping in where help was needed, filling the gaps they couldn't manage. When daycare was too expensive, I kept the children at my place so they wouldn't lose their spot in the program. When their car broke down, I loaned mine without hesitation. I even covered 2 months of their rent when Lucan's contracting business hit a dry spell, telling myself it was temporary and they'd find their feet again. None of it felt like sacrifice at the time. It was just family. I had grown up believing that when one of you was struggling, the others carried a bit of the load. But somewhere along the way, what I gave became what they expected. I glanced toward the small safe tucked into the corner of my closet. My late husband had insisted on adding my name to the townhouse deed when we bought it, even though Lucan argued it should eventually be his. "Paperwork matters," my husband used to say. "It keeps what's yours yours." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now that clause might be the one thread keeping my home from becoming someone else's claim. I left the bedroom and went to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. The faint sound of children laughing drifted from the street outside, pulling me into the present. The scarf was gone, yes. But the deeper truth was more unsettling. It wasn't just a missing item. It was a reminder that my place in their lives had shifted from trusted guardian to an afterthought. That night, as I locked the front door, my mind was already sifting through ways to quietly reassert what was mine before anyone else decided to rewrite the story. The next morning, I called an old locksmith I'd used for years, asking if he could stop by to check my locks. He arrived before noon, toolbox in hand, and worked methodically along the front and back doors. "No signs of forced entry," he said, straightening up. If someone got in, they had a key. That settled into me like a stone. Only a few people had keys, Lucan and Rihanna among them. I thanked him, paid for his time, and stood in the doorway long after his truck pulled away. The air outside, crisp and sharp. Around midday, my phone buzzed with a text from Luke and Hope. The trip was okay. Busy week ahead. Will call when things slow down. No mention of the funeral, no acknowledgement of the long flight home, or the fact that his wife's reply had been nothing short of dismissive. I stared at the message until the words blurred, then set the phone down without answering. Later, Moretta stopped by with a loaf of bread, and in her roundabout way confirmed what I'd been suspecting. A neighbor down the street had been talking about the Thalen party last weekend, hosted, apparently, in my home. Lucan had apparently introduced the place as their house now. The phrase echoed in my head, bitter and foreign. I walked through each room slowly, touching the edges of tables, the backs of chairs, the cool surface of the mantel. Everything was in its place, yet I felt the subtle shift of a space that had been inhabited by others. In the kitchen, I opened the cabinet where I kept my tea. A tin I'd left half full was now nearly empty. It was a small thing, but it made my jaw tighten. Someone had made themselves comfortable here. By the time the sun dipped low, I had already decided this wouldn't be met with confrontation, not yet. If they thought my home was theirs, I would let them think it just long enough to see where they planned to take it. Then I'd be ready to take it back on my terms. That evening, while sorting through the last of my travel papers, I came across a business card tucked between the pages of my passport. Quendrick Lorne. His neat handwriting was on the back, in case you ever need a story told. We'd run into each other in the departure lounge in Dublin. Years ago, we'd both worked in the travel industry, me as a consultant, him as a journalist, always chasing the next horizon. Back then, I'd given him an introduction that led to one of his most celebrated articles. At the airport, we'd shared coffee while waiting for boarding, catching up on decades in an hour. When we landed in Boston, he'd even offered to help me with my luggage, walking me as far as the curb before we went our separate ways. Now, looking at his card, the memory took on new weight. Quendrick had a knack for making people pay attention, and not just in print. If I wanted to send a message without raising my voice, he was exactly the kind of person who could help me do it. I set the card aside and glanced toward the closet where my sister's scarf should have been. Rihanna had worn it like it was hers in my own home while I was away, burying the only sibling I had left. The thought turned my grief into something more focused, sharper around the edges. The phone sat heavy in my hand for a long moment before I tapped out a short message. Back from Ireland. Tea sometime this week. I sent it before I could talk myself out of it. His reply came within minutes. Absolutely. Name the time. I closed my eyes, the faintest sense of control returning to me. If Lucan and Rihanna wanted to play ownership in whispers and behind closed doors, I'd answer in a way they wouldn't see coming quietly, but in plain sight. By the time I turned in for the night, the card was on the kitchen table right beside the kettle. In the morning, I would decide exactly how to use it. The following afternoon, I arranged the living room just so curtains drawn back for light a fresh pot of tea on the low table, my sister's gardenia-scented candle burning softly in the corner. I wanted the space to feel unmistakably mine. When Quendrick arrived, he stepped through the doorway with that same easy warmth I remembered from years ago. We settled into conversation as naturally as if no time had passed. He asked about Ireland, and I told him enough to convey the weight of the trip without sinking into its heaviness. Then I spoke about the townhouse, how I'd built a life here after my husband died, the history in each corner, the garden I'd kept blooming every summer. At some point, I slipped the deep green and gold scarf over my shoulders. Not the original, it was still missing, but a near-perfect twin I'd bought years ago. Quendrick noticed it immediately. "That's beautiful," he said, his photographer's eye clearly ticking away. He asked if I'd mind him taking a few photos for a human interest piece he was working on about resilience after loss. I agreed, knowing exactly how I'd frame the moment in my mind, me at home, rooted and steady. He snapped shots of me pouring tea standing by the bookshelf, leaning against the doorway to the kitchen. As we talked, I made sure to drop certain details: how long I'd lived here, how my husband and I had bought it together, how the deed was still in my name. Not stated like a declaration, but woven into the fabric of the conversation, so it would come through in whatever he wrote. When he left, he promised to send me the article once it went live. I walked him to the door, watching as he headed down the path, the late afternoon sun catching the edge of his camera strap. Back inside, I cleared the tea things and straightened the scarf on the back of a chair. The air in the room felt different now, charged with a quiet anticipation. Something had been set in motion, and all I had to do was wait for it to take shape. 3 mornings later, my inbox lit up with a message from Quendrick. The subject line read, "Thought you'd like to see this." I opened the link, and there it was, his latest feature already on the front page of the lifestyle section. The headline was warm and inviting. "Widowed homeowner welcomes old friend after journey abroad." Beneath it, the photos told their own story. Me in my living room, tea in hand, framed by the familiar shelves and windows. Me wearing the green and gold scarf, sunlight catching its threads. Me in a home that looked lived in by me alone. The text was even more deliberate. He'd written about our decades of friendship, my career in travel, and my recent trip to Ireland to lay my sister to rest. He wove in small details I'd offered, how my husband and I had bought the townhouse together, how the garden had been my refuge for years, how I'd returned to find comfort in its walls. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The home was mine. The life inside it was mine, and it was now printed for anyone to read. By noon, messages started trickling in. Old clients, distant cousins, even people I hadn't spoken to in years sent notes of condolence and admiration. They praised my strength, commented on how beautiful the house looked, reminisced about times they'd visited. One message, however, never came from Lucan or Rihanna. I went about my day as usual, tending to the garden, answering a few calls, keeping the article open in a browser tab like a quiet shield. By evening, I'd read it 3 times. Each pass made me feel more anchored, more certain that whatever lines they'd been trying to blur had now been drawn in ink. When I finally closed the laptop, the room felt still again, but not in the way it had when I first returned from Ireland. This stillness carried weight, a pause before the inevitable shift. Somewhere out there, I knew Rihanna had read it too, and that her silence was only temporary. It was just after 8 the next morning when my phone rang. The caller ID lit up with Lucan's name. I let it ring twice before answering, steadying my voice. "Morning, Mom." He said, too bright, the kind of tone he used when trying to skate past something unpleasant. "Saw that article about you and your house. Nice photos." "Thank you," I said evenly. Quendrick has a good eye. There was a pause, the faint sound of him clearing his throat. "You, didn't mention to me you were doing that." "I didn't think it needed mentioning," I replied. It was about my trip and my home. Simple enough. He let out a short laugh, the kind without humor. "Right. It's just, people are talking. Rihanna feels like you're trying to make a point." I let that hang for a moment. If someone sees a point in me living in my own home, that's their interpretation. Silence followed heavier this time. I could almost hear him deciding whether to push further. When he spoke again, the brightness was gone. "You know, Rihanna's parents have been really comfortable there. They've gotten used to helping out with things." "Helping out," I repeated, my voice calm. "Is that what they call hosting parties in my living room while I'm burying my sister?" His inhale was sharp, caught between surprise and defensiveness. "Moretta's been talking, I see." "Moretta didn't put my scarf around Rihanna's neck," I said. "And she didn't take the tea from my cupboard." Another pause, this one stretching, until it felt like the call might drop. Then he muttered, "Maybe we should all sit down and talk." "Maybe we should," I said, and ended the call before he could shape that into an advantage. I set the phone down my hand, steady. Whatever meeting he was imagining, it wouldn't go the way he thought. In fact, by the time we sat down, the rest of the plan would already be in motion. I spent the rest of that day making calls, not to Lucan, not to Rihanna, but to the people whose voices carried weight where it mattered. My lawyer, for one. We reviewed the deed, the trust, and every document my husband and I had kept meticulously over the years. By the time we hung up, the language securing the property was not just intact, but reinforced in a way that left no room for interpretation. Next was my financial advisor. We shifted certain accounts, ensuring that any access not explicitly mine was locked down. If anyone tried to present themselves as having authority over my assets, the answer would be immediate and final. 2 days later, when we finally sat at the same table, Luke and Riona and me, I let them speak first. They dressed it up in politeness, but the meaning was plain. They wanted more presence in the house, more say in how it was used. When they finished, I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the updated legal documents clearly stating the property's ownership and my sole authority over it. "This isn't up for negotiation," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Rihanna's eyes flickered toward Lucan, who shifted in his seat. "We just thought," he began, but I cut in. "I know what you thought," I said, "but you mistook kindness for permission." The silence that followed was almost satisfying. I gathered my folder, stood, and walked them to the door. There was no argument, no raised voice, only the sound of their footsteps fading down the walkway. That evening, I made tea and sat by the window, the garden beyond glowing softly in the dusk. My scarf, the original one, was folded neatly on the arm of my chair. Moretta had found it in a donation bin down the street and brought it back that afternoon. I draped it over my shoulders, feeling its familiar weight. Outside, the street was quiet, and for the first time since returning from Ireland, so was my mind.